Do you have any more to say before we jump right into the first one of dominant?
No, let's do it.
All right. So dominant INFPs.
Yeah.
What does this flavoring of INFP look like?
So this is a flavoring of INFP that I think people, well, it's not the prototype in a lot of people's minds. In fact, this INFP might think of themselves as having judger preferences, or possibly even being an ENFP. But it's a legit INFP subtype. These INFPs are more driven and confident, and they have a very strong character. That's what they show to the world, is a strong character. They are almost like on a quest or a crusade, and they hold themselves together with endurance toward that ideal. So they're very driven to make sure that whatever it is that they believe should be mirrored in the world, their personal ideals, they're very driven to accomplish them. So it's an ambitious flavor of INFP. They are also relatively quick with their decision-making or their processing of new information, and then sharing their reaction to it. And so that might not be decision-making per se, but it's a faster action or reaction time than their other INFP subtype brethren. And I think that's important to know, that there are some INFP subtypes that, this dominant one in particular, that actually has a little faster reaction time. Now, it's in comparison, though, to other INFPs. They're not going to probably have as quick a reaction time as, say, an ESTP type. Yeah. But in comparison with other INFPs, they are faster. And in part because they're relying a bit on templates. They use templates as ways of thinking and working that they can draw on quickly. And so in some ways, they've kind of pre-thought things out. They've sort of figured out how they feel about that thing. And so when it gets introduced to them, they have a strong reaction and they know how they're going to feel about that. They still have, though, the typical INFP, skills or talents at listening. So they still are very good with communication. They're very good at listening to other people. But unlike other INFP types, this is in particular listening for somebody's agenda. What is this person really motivated by? What is it that they really want underneath? And that's very clear to this subtype. They are also highly imaginative, just like other INFPs. And so they have strong access to their intuition, their intuitive side with imagination. Yeah. But because they favor a faster reaction time, and so they used some of these templates to do it, their intuition is almost like an on-off switch. They have access to strong imagination, but it might take a little bit of time for it to wake up. Yeah. And that means they can't, super rely on their intuition for whatever career they're choosing, because their intuition, it kind of slows them down a little bit. Yeah. Right? A little more than they want to be slowed down when they're trying to get their crusade accomplished.
Well, and I can imagine, you mentioned that they're very much listening for people's motivations, and maybe writ large, not just one person, but in aggregate. Because if you have to resource manage, which also includes managing people, to get something accomplished, and you're more dominant in your style, you have to know what gets that group to do this thing, or that person to do this thing. You may not have the talent as an INFP to have all the checklists and all of that. Mm-hmm. You need to probably rely on your motivational strategies of inspiration, yes, of motivation, of getting people inspired to do the thing you need them to do. So you have to listen for and track that as a dominant INFP. I mean, all INFPs do this, but I think dominant, it's probably a strategy to be able to lead and guide and get the things done they want to get done.
Right, exactly. And so because of that, their quiet time, of course, is precious, just like all introverts. They need that quiet time. But when they do that, they're determining how they feel about where they're at, any new inputs, whatever's going on. But the rumination, I think, is a little shorter than maybe for other INFPs. They probably give themselves a little less quiet time than other INFPs do, because these are an INFP that's on a mission, right? And so they expect more out of themselves when they're bringing this to the world. So when they get that quiet time, they're doing a lot of sorting about, what's happened, how it makes them feel, what's important to them, and anything that isn't might not get a lot of rumination time about why. It might just get edited out. Yeah. And they're just staying on mission and on track. And that's what makes it dominant, right? And so the qualities and characteristics that you might see in this type is that they might appear maybe even overly idealistic to other people. They will appear to be very ethical and moral. It's very important for them to show up as examples of ethics and morality. So they might appear a little overly idealistic. They might also appear a little preachy sometimes, maybe rigid, sometimes extreme. But they're actually really good at making the thing that's important to them happen. And so they're also inspirational leaders. They're fantastic. People will follow them because they can see their vision and they want to follow them. So there's a little bit of rigidity that's required in order to make all of that happen. And so anything public facing, anything that is administrative, they actually tend to do very well in. It depends, of course, on their interests, but the kinds of things that they tend to pursue is, interestingly enough, business, education, law, music, psychology, social work. Those are all very popular choices. They oftentimes have a talent for music if they choose to develop it. This subtype does. But I think with specificity, some of the careers that they might choose, or what I've seen dominant INFPs choose, are things like nonprofit executive director. I've seen examples of that. You mentioned INFP with writing. Journalists in particular for dominant INFPs, journalism, copywriting, right? Anything that kind of requires that like more assertive voice. And of course, psychology is always an interest.
Yeah. So what about mistypes? I know this type, because they're so dominant, they might show up as somebody different.
Yeah, I think as I mentioned before, they might think of themselves as having judger tendencies or preferences. They might think they're a judger type. They might also believe they're an extrovert. I wouldn't be surprised if they think that they might even be a TJ type, right? This might be an INFP that believes that they have INTJ preferences perhaps, or maybe even ENTJ preferences because of that capacity to get, to really focus and hone in on and lead and get things done in their minds. Yeah.
So that's all the topical stuff. If you are a type geek, type nerd, and you're following along and you're looking for more of the deeper stuff connected to cognitive functions, they use the cognitive functions. You already talked about them, Antonia. Introverted feeling, authenticity, is the driver or dominant cognitive function for INFPs. The co-pilot or auxiliary is extroverted intuition. We've nicknamed it exploration. So they're judging, they're going through their world, making decisions using authenticity, introverted feeling, and they're perceiving the world and understanding it using advanced pattern recognition, extroverted intuition or exploration. So there's an attunement of these functions, and that's why they're a dominant subtype. How these functions show up for an INFP, and that's all of these have a pattern to them.
Right.
The way these functions are attuned, that's what makes this the case. So let's talk about that.
So each function, all 8 cognitive functions, can have what's called an analytic preference or a holistic preference. An analytic is more of a targeted, focused, driven energy. It's a little bit more like having blinders on, but moving forward towards a single target. Whereas the holistic preference of a function is a little bit more open. It sees more of the peripheral. It wants to take in a broader expanse, but because of that, it has a more diffused energy. And it tends to be a little better at being receptive, seeing a bigger picture, being receptive, not as driven, but taking in a little bit more territory. For dominant INFPs, both the perceiving and the judging functions that you mentioned, they're both analytic. They both have that targeted, almost blinders on sort of orientation that makes them so assertive in the world.
Yeah. And if you're following along with neurotransmitters, this subtype is attracted to testosterone.
Yeah, that's the neurotransmitter that it's most associated with is testosterone.
And each one has those associations.
Yeah. And if you want more information about this, by the way, we recorded an entire podcast with Dr. Dario Nardi about subtypes, so you can go look that up, and we'll make sure to have links under the episode.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the dominant subtype. We got 3 more left.